What's the most messed up thing your relative did? My grandmother had always been responsible, saving every penny for the day she'd need a good nursing home. She had over $200,000 set aside, a fund my mom and her sister, my Aunt Carol, were supposed to manage. When Grandma's health took a nosedive, we started touring facilities, only to find the account was nearly empty. We were blindsided. My mom was in tears, thinking the bank had made a mistake, but my aunt was oddly calm. She suggested it was a blessing in disguise, saying, "Now we have to take care of her ourselves. It's what's right." It took my dad less than a week to find the paper trail. Aunt Carol had been siphoning money for years, lavish vacations, a new car, designer clothes, all while Grandma thought her future was secure. The worst part was the performance she put on. She called a family meeting, crying about how it was our duty to take Grandma in, trying to guilt my parents into footing the bill for her own theft. When my dad confronted her with the bank statements, she didn't even deny it. She just said Grandma would have wanted her to be happy. My Uncle Rick was always in trouble, mostly with money. One day, we got a call that he'd had a fatal boating accident. There was no body found, but they recovered his wallet in a capsized boat. We had a funeral and everything. The whole family mourned him for 5 years. Then my cousin was driving cross-country for a new job and stopped at a random McDonald's in rural Ohio. He walks in and there, behind a counter wearing a headset and a name tag that said Mitch, was Uncle Rick. He had faked his own death to escape nearly $100,000 in debt and just started over. My cousin just stood there, speechless, before walking up to the counter and saying, "Rick?" My uncle looked like he'd seen a ghost, dropped a tray of fries, and tried to run out the back. The aftermath was a nightmare of legal issues, but the weirdest part was telling my grandma her dead son was not only alive, but had been flipping burgers for half a decade. My older sister and I always had a strained relationship, but I never knew she was capable of this. I was going through a rough patch and started online therapy sessions from my bedroom. I thought they were completely private. My sister, however, thought I was being dramatic and wanted to prove it. She managed to install spyware on our shared family computer, which let her screen record my sessions. One night, during a huge family argument about my mental health, she got a smug look on her face and said, "You guys don't get it. Let me just show you." She pulled out her phone and played a recording of me sobbing to my therapist about my deepest insecurities. My parents just stared, horrified. It wasn't just a violation of privacy. She weaponized my vulnerability to win an argument. I haven't spoken a single word to her since that day, and I don't think I ever will. My grandfather was a man of few words. He had a glass case in his study with old, dusty war medals and a rusty pistol, and he told us he was a decorated hero from the Pacific Theater. We were so proud of him. When he was on his deathbed, he called us all into his room, wheezing. We thought he was going to share some final words of wisdom. Instead, he confessed that he was never in the army. He was a wanted bank robber from the 1950s who had been on the run his entire life. The medals were fakes he bought at a flea market, and the heirlooms he'd given us over the years were all stolen goods from his various heists. His real name wasn't even the one we knew. He died about an hour later, leaving us all in stunned silence, realizing our entire family history was a complete lie built by a man who was more like a movie villain than a war hero. My brother was always the golden child in sports, while I was the art kid. I worked my asterisk off and got a full scholarship to a prestigious art school. He was struggling at a community college, and the jealousy was palpable. The night before my final portfolio review, the one that determined my graduation with honors, I came home to a weird smell, like a barbecue. I went into the backyard and found my brother standing over the grill, poking at the embers. Lying on the ground next to him was the charred metal clasp from my portfolio case. He had taken every single piece of my work, 4 years of paintings, sketches, and sculptures, and burned it all to ash. He didn't even try to hide it. He just looked at me with this dead-eyed expression and said, "Now you don't have anything to be so proud of." It wasn't just about destroying my art. It was about destroying my future, and he did it without a shred of remorse. My dad had a serious heart condition, and my mom, a registered nurse, was in charge of his complex medication schedule. She was always complaining about him working too much, begging him to retire, but he loved his job. Over several months, he started getting weaker, more confused, and had several close calls that landed him in the hospital. The doctors were baffled. They said his medication should have been working. One day, I I went to refill his pill organizer and noticed the heart pills looked slightly different. On a hunch, I took one to a pharmacist friend who confirmed my fear. They were placebos, basically just sugar pills. My mom had been methodically switching them out, making my dad just sick enough that he'd be forced to quit his job. She was a nurse. She knew exactly what she was doing, and she was willing to risk his life just to get her way. He divorced her immediately after he recovered. My dad ran a small, under-the-table handyman business. It wasn't much, but it paid the bills and kept a roof over our heads. He taught my cousin the trade, hoping he might take over one day. But my cousin got lazy and started cutting corners, so my dad had to fire him. The fallout was nuclear. My cousin was so vengeful that he gathered up every bit of information he had on my dad's business, names, dates, cash payments, and sent a detailed, anonymous tip to the IRS. We were hit with a full-blown audit that we were completely unprepared for. The back taxes, fines, and legal fees were astronomical. It completely destroyed us financially. We lost our house, and my parents had to declare bankruptcy. My cousin watched it all happen, never saying a word. We only found out it was him years later when his ex-girlfriend told us, sick with guilt. He ruined our lives over getting fired from a job he barely did. The day I turned 18 was supposed to be a milestone, the first day of my adult life. For my father, it was an opportunity. Without my knowledge, he used my social security number and newly legal status to apply for a dozen different credit cards in my name. He had them all sent to a P.O. box I didn't know about. Over the next year, he maxed every single one of them out. We're talking tens of thousands of dollars on gambling, trips, and who knows what else. I didn't find out until I applied for a student loan and was immediately rejected for having a credit score in the low 400s. When I confronted him, he acted like he'd done nothing wrong, saying he planned to pay it all back. He never did, of course. He filed for bankruptcy himself a year later, leaving me legally responsible for a mountain of debt that took me nearly a decade to climb out of. He single-handedly sabotaged my financial future before it even began. I was madly in love with my fiancée, and I thought my stepmom was one of my closest friends. My dad had been working out of town for a few months, so she was staying with us a lot. I just figured she was lonely. One evening, we were all watching a movie on the family's shared iPad when a notification popped up on the screen. It was a message from my stepmom, and the preview was graphic. It was from a contact saved as Mr. Fix-It, and it detailed exactly what he wanted to do to her later that night. My heart sank. Curious and horrified, I opened the message thread and scrolled up. There were months of them. Pictures, sex, plans they'd made. And then I saw a photo of the sender. It was my fiancé. They had been sleeping together for almost a year, in my house, in my bed. My stepmom wasn't just cheating on my dad. She was doing it with a man I was supposed to marry. My sister was a pathological attention seeker, but she took it to a terrifying new level. At 25, she announced she had a rare, aggressive form of leukemia. The family was devastated. She shaved her head, started a GoFundMe for her medical bills, and posted weak, frail-looking selfies from a bed. The money poured in over $30,000. She seemed to love the sympathy, the constant check-ins, the hero narrative she was building. But my uncle, a doctor, grew suspicious. Her stories about her treatments had medical inconsistencies. He decided to call the oncology department at the hospital where she claimed she was a patient. They had no record of her ever. He confronted her, and the whole charade unraveled. She had faked everything. The cancer, the chemo, all of it. The GoFundMe money had gone to a new car and a trip to Hawaii. She didn't just lie. She preyed on the love and compassion of everyone who cared about her. My wedding day was perfect right up until the speeches. My maid of honor was my Aunt Linda, who had always been a bit of a wild card. She got up to the microphone, visibly drunk, and started rambling. At first, it was funny, but then her tone shifted. She started talking about a heart-to-heart she'd had with my new husband, Mark, the night before at the rehearsal dinner. She slurred. He told me something so sweet. He said that even though he loves you, he'll always wonder what if about his high school sweetheart, Sarah. The entire room went silent. Sarah was there, sitting at a table with her husband. Mark's face went white. He later explained that my aunt had cornered him and twisted his words, but the damage was done. She dropped a bomb of doubt and humiliation in the middle of our wedding reception for no reason other than to cause drama. We still get awkward questions about it to this day. Our family history was a point of pride, centered around my great-grandmother, a strong woman who lost her husband in World War II and raised her kids alone. It was a story of resilience we all admired. For Christmas, I got the whole family 23andMe kits, thinking it would be fun to map out our European roots. The results came back and turned everything we knew on its head. I had hundreds of DNA matches I didn't recognize, all from a different family tree in another state. After some digging and awkward emails, I pieced together the truth. My great-grandmother hadn't been a war widow. Her first husband came home from the war very much alive. She had simply abandoned him and their 3 young children, moved 2 states away, changed her name, and started a completely new family, our family. The man we thought was a war hero died alone and heartbroken, and his other children never knew what happened to their mother. My Uncle David has a notoriously short fuse. One year, my parents decided to have a smaller, quieter Christmas and didn't invite my uncle and his chaotic family. He took it as a grave insult. His response wasn't a nasty phone call or a passive-aggressive text. Instead, he called Child Protective Services and filed an anonymous report against my parents, claiming they were abusive monsters. He made up the most horrific, detailed stories, that they locked us in the basement, withheld food, and beat us regularly. 2 days before Christmas, 2 social workers showed up at our door. My siblings and I were interviewed separately, our home was searched, and my parents were treated like criminals. It was terrifying and humiliating. The case was obviously closed when they found 0 evidence, but we knew it was him. He was willing to put his own brother and his nieces and nephews through a traumatic investigation just because his feelings were hurt over a dinner invitation. When our father passed away, he didn't have much, but he had a beautiful antique watch that had been in the family for generations. It was the only thing I asked for, and my brother agreed it should be mine. A week after the funeral, I asked him for it, and he started making excuses. First, he said it was at the jeweler's getting cleaned. Then he said he put it in a safety deposit box and forgot the key. After a month of his lies, I got a call from a local pawn shop. The owner was a family friend and recognized the watch when my brother came in to sell it. He had pawned our father's most cherished possession, the one thing I wanted to remember him by, to get cash for his online gambling addiction. He didn't just steal a watch, he stole a piece of our father's memory from me, and he did it without a second thought, all for a few $100. I grew up thinking I had the perfect family. My dad was my hero, my mom was my best friend, and my uncle was the cool guy who always came to our family events. When I was 28, I took a DNA test for fun, just to see my ancestry. The results came back and shattered my entire world. It listed my uncle as my biological father. I confronted my mom, and the whole sordid story came out. She and my uncle had a brief affair shortly before she married my dad. When she found out she was pregnant, she didn't know who the father was. My uncle and my dad were brothers, so they made a secret pact. My dad would raise me as his own, and no one would ever speak of it again. My entire life, the 3 of them upheld this lie. My dad wasn't my biological father, my uncle was, and I was the product of a betrayal that had been hidden in plain sight for nearly 3 decades. My cousin has always been a reckless mess, but one night he took it to a whole new level. I was woken up at 3 a.m. by frantic banging on my door. It was my cousin, pale and shaking. He shoved a set of keys into my hand and begged me to let him park his car in my garage. I was half asleep and confused, but I agreed. The next morning, I saw the car. The entire front end was smashed, and there was blood on the shattered windshield. I turned on the news and felt my stomach drop. There had been a hit and run on a nearby highway, and a cyclist was in critical condition. My cousin had hit someone and then drove straight to my house to hide the evidence. He came over later that day, crying and begging me not to say anything, making me an accomplice to his crime. He didn't just ask me to hide a car. He asked me to hide a crime that nearly killed someone. I was raised by my grandmother, who always told me a heartbreaking story about my mother. She said my mom was a troubled young woman who ran off with a bad crowd and abandoned me on her doorstep as a baby. I grew up believing my mother never wanted me, and I resented her for it. When my grandmother passed away, I was tasked with cleaning out her attic. Tucked away in a corner, I found a dusty shoebox. Inside were dozens of letters, all addressed to me, all in my mother's handwriting. There were birthday cards, Christmas cards, and long letters explaining how much she loved and missed me. Every single one of them was marked return to sender. My grandmother hadn't just taken me in. She had actively pushed my mother out of my life, returning every letter and telling her to stay away. She let me believe I was unloved for 20 years just to keep me for herself. My mom has struggled with bipolar disorder her whole life, and my dad was always her biggest supporter, or so I thought. After they divorced, he announced he was writing a memoir about their life together. We all assumed it would be a compassionate look at their journey. But when the book was published, we were horrified. He titled it Living with a Hurricane and filled it with the most sensationalized, exaggerated versions of my mom's manic episodes. He described her lowest, most private moments in graphic detail, painting her as a crazy, unpredictable monster. He did it all without her consent, twisting her pain into a narrative that would sell copies. He took her real-life illness, a source of immense struggle and vulnerability, and turned it into a cheap, exploitative drama for his own profit. He didn't care about her dignity, he only cared about the story he could spin. My sister was a rising star at her accounting firm, known for her integrity. Her husband, my brother-in-law, worked in the same department but was lazy and constantly getting into trouble. One day, she was called into HR and abruptly fired. They accused her of embezzling nearly $50,000. She was stunned and had no idea what they were talking about. They presented her with evidence, emails sent from her computer, and forged financial records on her hard drive. She was facing prison time. It was only after hiring a forensic IT specialist that the truth came out. Her husband had been the one stealing the money. When he suspected the company was closing in on him, he used his access to her computer to plant the fake evidence, meticulously framing her to save himself. He was willing to let the mother of his children go to prison for a crime he committed, just to cover his own tracks. After my mother died, my great-aunt was a huge comfort to me. She always talked about how much she loved and missed her. It seemed sweet, until I visited her house for the first time in years. She told me she had set up a little memorial for my mom in the basement. I expected a few photos on a shelf. What I walked into was a full-blown shrine. An entire wall was covered with pictures of my mom, many of which had been stolen from our family albums. She had my mom's old college sweatshirt displayed on a mannequin, a glass case with her old hairbrushes, and most disturbingly, several small glass vials containing what she claimed were locks of my mom's hair. It was obsessive and deeply unsettling. She wasn't just mourning. She was treating my dead mother like a personal saint or a collector's item. It was one of the creepiest, most violating things I had ever seen.